Okay, welcome to the Gorgonzola class. This is Kate Johnson with The Art of Cheese. I think most of you know me by now, but if not, I do own a little cheese making school in Longmont, Colorado, where for many years we taught in-person classes only, although we did have a DVD and a few online classes. But of course, like many businesses, the pandemic forced us to go virtual, which actually has turned out to be a great thing, because as you'll see in this class today, this was a class I could not have taught in person without an awful lot of fralderall, I guess is what I can say, because this has a lot of steps and a lot of waiting and a lot of different stages. And it would have just been really hard to do this in a 2-hour class. You know, we would have had to be together for months. So in the beauty of these virtual classes is I can show you every single step in a fair amount of detail in a pretty short amount of time. So again, those of you who know me know that I got my start with cheese making through some dairy goats. Although this class today is not specifically a goat cheese, my start was with the goats. And so I always like to give you a quick little tour of my farm where my cheese making in-person classes take place currently. We're up just a little outside of Boulder, Colorado, and we raise Nubian dairy goats. So those are the cuties here. These were last spring's babies. We will start kidding again in a month or so. We have about 10 does and a couple of bucks and some random retired folks, older goats. And then this is our llama Seeger, who's our guard llama. And this pretty spotted girl here is Rachel, who is going to be featured on the Rachel Ray show soon because she's nicknamed after Rachel Ray. At any rate, we are nestled up against the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. And so it's a beautiful, beautiful spot to raise goats and make cheese. But let's get back to the class at hand here. So Gorgonzola is a blue cheese, obviously. And as I said, this is a bit of an advanced cheese, but if you are somewhat newer to cheese making, or if you just want to review some things, I did send out to you a link to our Cheese Making 101 video, and that's about a 20-minute class that will just go over some of the real basics, the basic ingredients, the basic science behind cheese making, basic equipment needs. And there's also a little recipe for ricotta. So if you haven't viewed that yet, or if you're new to this and I'm going a little quickly through some of those details, know that you have access to that. You also received the downloadable recipe for this class, as well as a link to some food safety tips. And so rather than repeat that in every class, we encourage you to look over that on your own. And then throughout the class, I will talk a little bit about sourcing ingredients, and you will see that I lean heavily toward the New England Cheesemaking Supply Company. Part of that is I really do feel like they're the most comprehensive cheesemaking supply source out there. They've been doing it probably the longest, and they have a little bit of everything and a lot of good customer support. So I do reference them a lot. I will probably mention a few others if I think of it. And then in terms of milk, that's our big wild card. Everybody that's watching this class is in a different place. We all have different access to milks. I make a lot of cheeses with goat milk because I have goats. Many of you just have a grocery store down the street and that's it. And so we are going to talk a little bit about sourcing milk and about the best milks for this cheese. And then again, on the New England Cheesemaking Supply website, they do have a milk resource page if you want to up your game and get some fresher milk. I see that Jeff in the chat is saying that they have goats, which is awesome. And I will tell you that although this is a cow milk cheese, you're going to notice some of the milk being suspiciously white because I used goat milk for quite a few of my initial makes because I have goats and I had a lot of goat milk. So it can be made with goat milk. It just traditionally isn't. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Gorgonzola before we launch into the recipe. This is an Italian blue cheese, and it is named after the city where it originated. And I pulled up this great map of the cheeses of Italy, and you'll see Gorgonzola up here in the Lombardia region, which is very close to Milan. I'm super excited to have this map and also to do this cheese, because I'm actually taking a group of students, some of you whom are on this call today, to Italy in May, and we will be in the Lombardia region for the beginning of our tour. So you can bet we're going to be getting some good Gorgonzola. So this is a little picture of the town of Gorgonzola. Now, Gorgonzola in Italy is a DOP cheese, that stands for Protected Designation of Origin. And what that means is a lot of European cheeses have some type of designation like this, that they can only be made in certain regions and with certain conditions. And so this particular cheese in Italy is only made in 2 regions, Piedmont and Lombardia, and it must be made with milk from cows that are raised in that region. So some of those cows might look a little something like this. It doesn't specify what breed of cows. Many DOP and protected cheeses actually designate the breed of cow or goat or sheep. But in this case, it just designates that they needed to be raised in that region. And you might wonder, like, why does that matter? Well, the milk is really the key to cheese making. And yes, we're going to make this cheese on our own. It won't be exactly what it would be if we were making it in the Lombardia region of Italy, because our animals, wherever we're getting our milk, aren't eating the same diet. They aren't acclimated to that climate. They don't have the same animal husbandry practices. And all of those things will affect your final cheese. But have no fear, you will make something really good and pretty darn close to that cheese. Now, Gorgonzola is very recognizable because of this marbling pattern. And this marbling pattern was originally the result of a mistake, as so many cheeses, but I would say almost every blue cheese out there has its roots in a mistake, because who would purposely put blue mold in the middle of your cheese, right? And many of those mistakes have some type of legend that goes with it that says how that mistake happened. And usually it has something to do with some star-crossed lovers that got preoccupied. So in this case, it was some herdsman that went off to chase after his lover and left a batch of cheese curds sitting in the cheese room, and then came back the next day and made another batch and tried to hide those original curds inside that batch so he wouldn't get caught. And that's what this original technique became. It's often referred to of 2 pastes, because what the technique involves is making one batch of curds one day and then combining that with a fresh batch of curds made the next day. And that original batch is kind of hidden in the center of the wheel. And because they're older, more acidic, drier, they don't knit together very well. And that gives all kinds of nooks and crannies for the blue molds to grow. And so while this is the original way Gorgonzola was made, it's not made that way anymore, even in Italy. However, we are going to learn to make it that way. They've learned a lot of ways to make it quicker and easier through technology and equipment, and a lot of piercing of the cheeses. But we're going to learn that old style method today. All right, and Gorgonzola does come in 2 different varieties. There's dolce, which is the sweet version, and picante, which is spicy or savory. And these are similar makes. There are some differences, and I'll point them out to you, but different affinage. And of course, affinage referring to other little things that might happen during aging. So the dolce version is milder and it's creamier. And that would be this one pictured in the front here, although this is just one version of what dolce might look like. And I'm going to show you lots of other pictures. Whereas the picante is more pungent, a little drier or chalkier, and stronger flavored. So this course, when I developed it, it was actually students in the Art of Cheesemaking Club that requested this particular cheese. And I had made it once years and years ago, but I don't even think I used this 2 pastes method. and obviously wasn't wowed enough with it to make it again. So I had to do a lot of research to get this class together. And in fact, I referenced a lot of different recipe books. I had class notes from the class where I had taken it, some pretty great videos, and a lot of trial and errors. And one of the things I found as I developed this class was there wasn't a lot of consistency among recipes. Some things were consistent, but there was more variability in the recipes I found for this particular cheese than just about any other course I've developed, which made it both challenging and very interesting. But it also meant I had to do a lot more practicing and cobbling things together and figuring out which things in a small format like this worked the best. So this is the result of what I've learned. Now, learning doesn't stop just because I've started teaching the class. So it could be that I learn some more tips in the next few months, especially I have one aging right now, and I may share those with you down the line. But I was very happy with the final results that I did get. So that's what we're going with. All right, so Gorgonzola ingredients. Well, we already mentioned milk, and cow milk is the preferred milk for this. If you are going to substitute goat milk, because like me, you have goats, or you just really like goat milk, or you just want to give it a try, really the only thing you would need to do different here is cut back a little bit on the rennet. Rennet is species specific, and when a recipe is written for one species, the amount of rennet is for that species of milk. And so goat milk typically needs a little less rennet than cow milk. Usually I say cut back by about 10%. If you have really, really fresh milk, you might even get away with a little bit more than that, but that's in general. If you wanted to try this with sheep milk, Roquefort is the blue that's most famous for being a sheep milk cheese. You would cut back on your rennet by about 40%. So the rennet amount as written in the recipe is for cow milk. Now, because this is an advanced cheese that takes a lot of time both to make and to age, I really encourage you to step up your game in your milk source for this one. The first milk I'm showing here is what I often refer to lovingly as adequate but inferior milk, right? We should all know by now, no ultra pasteurized milks ever for cheese making. But pasteurized, homogenized milk from the grocery store will work for this cheese. It's not the best choice. And if it's all you have access to, I would add calcium chloride to this make. Calcium chloride is the liquid salt solution. It's also sold in powder form that helps set a firmer curd with milk that's been heavily processed. I would really recommend, though, that you try to source some non-homogenized milk, low temperature pasteurization and non-homogenized. If you have a good source of raw milk, you certainly, if you're comfortable with raw milk, could make this cheese with raw milk. It isn't traditionally, but this is a cheese that's going to age for more than 60 days. And so you certainly could. I would cut back on your cultures by half. Because again, this recipe assumes that you're using pasteurized milk. And so if you are going to substitute raw milk, cut back on those cultures, not the blue cultures, but your primary cultures, the mesophilic and thermophilic. So these just happen to be two brands of milk in my market that I have had good luck with. The Organic Valley Cream Top grass milk, whole milk I prefer, especially for this cheese, or the Origin milk, which is another wonderful non-homogenized milk in my area. You may have different milks where you are, and if you can get it right fresh off the farm, that's always the best. But these are some pretty good choices. Then as far as our cultures, this recipe does call for mesophilic culture and thermophilic culture. You may have seen recipes for this that called for buttermilk or buttermilk culture, or Bulgarian yogurt or Bulgarian yogurt culture. Just know that those are substitutions for mesophilic and thermophilic culture. So cultured buttermilk contains most of the same cultures, maybe with a little more complexity than our freeze-dried mesophilic culture. And yogurt, it doesn't have to just be Bulgarian yogurt. Good yogurts will carry those thermophilic cultures. So I have included that in the recipe if you're wanting to substitute those things. One of the reasons I like to use freeze-dried cultures is just they're a little bit more consistent in that we know exactly how much we need. And so our times and temperatures are geared toward these freeze-dried cultures. But some of you might also be really interested in natural cheese making, like what David Asher does, where he's using clabber culture from raw milk or kefir culture. We do have a brief course on those topics, and you could certainly use those types of cultures for this make. But since most people, at least in my circles, aren't making cheese that way and have easier access to these freeze-dried cultures, that's what we're using. That said, there are a lot of different mesophilic and thermophilic cultures or blends of these cultures. So I'm going to stick with the really kind of standard, what I call generic mesophilic and thermophilic. And these little packets are what you might recognize if you get yours from the New England Cheesemaking Supply Company. You'll also see these same cultures in my make videos where I'm using the bigger bulk packets that I got from them. But there are other cultures that are mesophilic and thermophilic that you could play around with a little bit and try and see if you're getting little different flavors and textures. For instance, in the mesophilic world, there's Flora Danica. And if you wanted a little more buttery aroma, that could be a fun substitute for this generic mesophilic. Or perhaps in the thermophilic, you want one of the other blends of thermophilic, or maybe you even want to use a mesophilic thermophilic blend, which New England Cheesemaking Supply has. You can always read the descriptions of those and decide whether you want to try them out, or maybe you have been trying some of those out and you have some theories about which you would like. But for the purposes of the class, I'm going to stick with these and those amounts. And then in terms of your blue mold, the two that I would recommend for this cheese are either the Penicillium roqueforti PV or the Penicillium roqueforti PS. There are 4 or 5 different strains of blue mold powders, and these are the two that are probably most associated with these cheeses. The PV is a little stronger flavored and is more associated with the picante version of this cheese, whereas the PS is a little bit milder and would maybe be more associated with the dolce. I myself only have the PS at this time, and so I made both versions with the PS. And I'll talk more about that at the end when we do some review. But if you have a totally different blue mold, and you know, these are expensive, these are $30, $35 a package, and you want to just try it with the one you have, by all means, I would try it with it. Just know that your results may be a little different. The blue mold color may be a little more green or a little more blue, or develop a little more quickly or a little more slowly, but you could do that. You also could try to get some good Gorgonzola that you really like and try propagating some of your own blue mold by scraping out some of that blue mold and making a slurry in your milk. The problem with that is it's a little hard to know just how much of that is going to really take hold. But if I were going to do that with this cheese, just because this is a complex make, I would probably do it in addition to a freeze-dried mold to try to get, you know, it's a way to steal some of the microflora from Italy. If you can get a good Italian Gorgonzola, take out some of their blue mold and put it right into a milk paste, adding it when you would add these blue spores. But I would probably also add some of the freeze-dried spores just to be sure you get a good inoculation. And then for rennet, I'm going to show us making it with animal rennet, and I prefer to use liquid rennet just because I find it a lot easier to work with in terms of measurements. You could certainly use vegetarian rennet for this cheese. Some people will detect a little bit of a bitter flavor from vegetarian cheeses as a cheese ages, but this cheese has a lot of other flavors going on, and I'm not sure whether I personally would notice that or not. But just remember, if you do use vegetarian liquid rennet, most of the time it's double strength, and you are going to want to cut the amount in half because, again, this recipe is written for animal rennet. If you're using freeze-dried tablets, just make sure that you know what the amount is. Most of the tablets I've seen are 1 tablet is 1 teaspoon, and you're going to crush that tablet up and dilute it in some non-chlorinated water. And then in terms of salt, our standard in cheese making is the Diamond Crystal kosher salt. And so that's really the salt that your amounts of salt are based on. And if you don't have access to this particular brand of salt, any non-iodized salt will work, but know that your saltiness may vary a little bit. So if you're using a much finer salt, you know, if you're not weighing your salt and you're just doing it by teaspoons, which is how I do the measurements, you may need to cut back a little bit on that salt. Or if you're doing a bigger crystal, it could be that you need a little bit more. So again, you know, this may take a few tries with whatever milk you have, which particular cultures you choose, what salt you have, and just your conditions, because everybody's cheese making room and equipment is a little different. But in terms of equipment, it's pretty basic for this cheese. One nice thing about this, although I do have it listed as an advanced cheese, it's not pressed. So you don't need a cheese press. You will need some forms and a draining rack, but you don't need a cheese press. You will need a pot. I'm doing this in 2 1-gallon makes, and I'm actually going to make 2 1-gallon wheels of cheese. You could do 2 half-gallon makes and just make 1 gallon, or you could make 2-gallon makes and make 1 2-gallon wheel. Okay, so just know there's a lot of variability about how you could do this. But again, I wrote it for 2 1-gallon makes. And then you'll need your basic things like a skimmer spoon and a thermometer, and little mini measuring spoons are handy because these amounts of culture at these small levels are pretty tiny, especially the blue mold powder. But if you don't have these and you have to figure out what a 32nd of a teaspoon is, you know, it's kind of a healthy pinch. Again, those cultures are secondary cultures, Penicillium roqueforti, and going a little over or a little under isn't going to affect a ton other than maybe how much blue you get. All right, so the way I've done this, these are the 1-gallon hard cheese forms from New England Cheesemaking Supply. So I'm using those for both of mine. This is just a cookie sheet with a cookie drying rack or cooling rack. And then these are some, what it's called needlepoint fabric. That's what I typically use. I find that very flexible, very easy to use. You can sanitize it. So this is my draining setup. Throughout the class, I'm going to say, you know, this is how I do it. It doesn't mean that's how you have to do it. Many of you have been making cheese before, and you have all kinds of different equipment or neat techniques that might work just as well, if not better. But if you're new to it and you're just getting started, these are some of the things that I like to use. And you don't need a real big draining pan for this because you're going to catch most of the way in the step where we use the colander. All right, and then just a reminder that the way you're going to be doing this is in 2 separate batches. So on day 1, you might think about starting in the afternoon and letting it sit overnight. And then on day 2, you might start in the morning and combine those 2 around noon. If it doesn't work exactly to that time schedule, don't worry about it, but that's how I did it. And that seems to keep me from having to get up in the middle of the night, but also having those 2 distinctly different pastes, right? The day 1 curds versus the day 2 curds. All right, we are finally ready to actually start making the cheese. For those of you who are here in person, if you have any questions up to this point, throw them into the chat box about ingredients. If you're watching this as a recorded class, just remember you can always email us at info@theartofcheese.com, and either Kelly or I will get back to you as quickly as possible. All right, so without further ado, the first step in my version of this recipe is to rehydrate the blue spores. So what I like to do is take a little bit of just non-chlorinated water, distilled, filtered, boiled, brought back to room temperature. Here's my P. roqueforti PS. And you're going to take your amount out, which for each make, I believe was a 32nd, or was it a 64th? Let me look at my little recipe. Yes, 32nd of a teaspoon, and just mix it up in there and let it rehydrate. Some of the recipes that I found had you just put the blue spores in when you're putting the paste into the forms. And I found that to really maximize the blue development and get that beautiful marbling pattern, rehydrating the blue spores ahead of time, I think is a better idea. And it needs to sit for about 30 minutes. So if you just do that first, by the time your milk is through the ripening process, they'll be ready to go in. Next, we're going to take our first batch, so in my case, a gallon of milk, and we're going to heat it up to 70 degrees, and then we're going to add our mesophilic and thermophilic cultures. So these would be called our primary or our starter cultures. I like to get them in around 70 degrees. Those of you who have been taking my classes for a while know a little bit about that, but if you're new to me, the idea here is that we want to get the good bacteria in there sooner rather than later, because if there happened to be a bad bacteria in your milk for some reason, the good guys can help overtake it. But 70 degrees is about that threshold where bacteria starts to really grow exponentially. So kind of getting those good guys in there at about 70 rather than waiting till our target temperature, which in this case is 90 degrees, is just a bit of an insurance policy. So again, you saw those packets were the bigger packets of those same generic meso and thermophilic cultures. So another difference between my recipes and many of the other cheese making books is I don't tell you that you need, for most cheeses, that you need to let it sit there and rehydrate for several minutes. And that's because I'm adding it at 70 rather than waiting till 90, which means I'm going to be stirring it and letting it rehydrate this whole time between 70 and 90 degrees. So it really doesn't need that time to rehydrate before you stir it in. So at this point, we've got our pot now up to 90 degrees after adding those cultures. We're going to cover the pot, taking it off the heat, and let it ripen for 30 minutes. So this ripening time is that initial time where the lactose conversion is happening. So this is where that culture is waking up and feasting on the sugar in the milk, converting that lactose to lactic acid. And in this particular recipe, that's about 30 minutes. Now, for those of you who love pH readings, I will give you one or two along the way. And but for the most part, I don't do a lot with pH readings within the class itself. But I will give you a couple. I think I wrote it into the recipe at one place. All right, so now we've ripened our milk for 30 minutes. It's sat there getting nice and acidic or starting the process. And now we're ready to add those rehydrated blue mold spores. So I do like to mix it up real good in the cup again before I pour it in, because they will settle out and sink to the bottom of your measuring cup. And then go ahead and start mixing it in. Now at this point, I do suggest this up and down motion, and that's because we're about to add the rennet. The rennet is our coagulant, and we don't want our milk swirling and swirling and swirling while it's starting to set up. So that up and down stirring motion really helps the milk get still quicker. So now we're going to add our rennet. Again, the amount written here, 1/4 teaspoon for a gallon of milk, would be liquid animal rennet with cow milk. If you're using vegetarian rennet, cut that amount in half. If you're using goat milk or sheep milk, cut back appropriately. And then we're going to just cover our pot, let it set for 30 to 45 minutes. Again, there are different things you can do to anticipate when the curd will be ready. There are flocculation tests you could do. There's, we're going to check the curd in a few minutes. What I find is every milk is going to behave a little differently. And so I'll give you a range here, 30 to 45 minutes. You're going to check it probably at 30 minutes. And what you're looking for is a clean break. If you don't have it at 30 minutes, wait another 10 or 15 minutes. If you don't have it then, you're going to have to keep waiting. Now, why does it take longer or shorter? Well, some of it has to do with just the quality of your milk. Better quality milks and fresher milks are going to set up much quicker than more heavily processed or less fresh milks. Also, the conditions in your room. Is it drafty? Is it holding the temperature? Some of you are very diligent about putting your pots in a sous vide bath, or perhaps putting it in the oven with the light on. That's probably one of the easiest ways to keep a pot of milk around 90 degrees. And then some of you are a little bit lazy like me and just leave it on the table and just wait until it coagulates. So it could be a range of those times. Also, as your rennet is getting older, it takes longer to coagulate. Sometimes if your culture is getting older, it takes longer for it to get to the proper pH level that your rennet would like it to be in order to coagulate in this time. So there's a whole host of reasons why your coagulation time may be quicker or take longer. And so again, the art of cheese making is to pay attention to what's happening in your pot and respond accordingly. But at around 30 to 45 minutes, you can check your curd by doing this little knife trick, or you might have another trick for checking the curd. That looked like a really nice clean break to me, and so I'm good with it. We're going to keep going. If I hadn't gotten a clean break there, I would have waited a while longer. And now we're going to cut the curds into 3/4 inch cubes. Now, this is the first place where I'm going to tell you we could do it a little differently if we've decided ahead of time this is going to be dolce versus picante. In theory, dolce and picante makes should be pretty much the same, and it's the aging. In fact, I watched this great video that I'll refer to a little bit later in the class of cheese being made in Italy, and their claim was it's all in the affinage. But having made this several times, I found that there are a few things during the make I might do differently if I know ahead of time I want this one to age as a dolce, the creamier, the milder version, versus a picante. And this is the first place where, well, the first place I might have made a difference is using a different type of Penicillium roqueforti. So I already mentioned that. The PS would be more appropriate for dolce, and the PV would be more appropriate for the picante. But at this stage, the cutting of the curds would make a difference. And so if we want higher moisture content in our final cheese, a bigger curd, a bigger cut here, where we're expressing less whey, would be desirable. So I would say this 3/4 inch cubes is perfect for the picante. If you know you're going to want this to be as creamy and decadent as possible in a dolce version, you might make these an inch in size. All right, and here is the horizontal cut. Again, many of you have all kinds of great techniques for doing this horizontal cut. I like to use the side of my skimmer spoon and just work my way down the pot, kind of envisioning that I'm going down, 3/4 of an inch at a time. Is it a perfect science? No, but having had my classroom in a professional cheesemaking facility for many years, even with their very expensive cheese harps, there was still a lot of additional cutting of curds with the ones that they missed along the way. So you can see here, I'm going back in, making a few more cuts where I can see some pretty big curds. So, get as close as you can. Just know that bigger curds is going to retain more moisture, and smaller curds is going to make your cheese drier. And so at the end of the day, when you get your final results and you're analyzing them, this is a thing to keep in mind. If your analysis of your cheese is it was drier and crumblier than I wanted, this is one place you could do it differently next time. Make your curds a little bigger. Now, this is another place where how you stir the curd not only is going to make your cheese turn out different, but it's also a function of your milk, okay? Stronger milk can handle more stirring. Weaker milk or weaker curds, you're gonna have to be very gentle. You can see by looking at these curds, they are so thick and so strong. This was my first make with goat milk, and this was, fall goat milk. It was very good, very strong, very easy to set up. I can stir this a lot more aggressively than I would if this was, let's say, grocery store pasteurized homogenized milk. I would have to be really gentle with those curds to not have them just break down into a million little pieces, which would result in a drier, crumblier cheese. But in general, let's just say you kind of have a mid-range milk, right? You're taking my advice, you're getting at least a grocery store version, pasteurized, non-homogenized cow milk. Then this formula works pretty well, where you would gently stir those curds for about 1 minute once every 10 minutes for an hour. Now, I often use a lot of terms like about, approximately, more or less. So I don't want you to get too hung up on it being exactly that. Don't turn a timer on for a minute. Well, you can if you want to. But in general, just know that what this means is we're going to gently stir every now and then for an hour, okay? We're going to do it more gently the weaker our curd is, which usually equates to lower quality milk. And we're probably going to stir a little more aggressively the stronger our curds are, which probably equates to better quality milk. Again, if you're making the dolce version, you're probably going to stir a little bit less. If you're doing the picante version, you're probably going to stir a little bit more because the difference in the final textures of those would warrant that change in how you stir. Incidentally, when I made my first batch, which is what most of the videos here are, they do change at some points because of having made this multiple times. But I made one big, the gallon one day, the gallon the second day. I made two separate 1 gallon batches. And my intention was to age one as a picante and one as a dolce. And so I did the entire make the same and just changed the aging. It was the results of those makes that has me tweaking some of these things now as I'm explaining it. They both turned out great, but the dolce needed a few tweaks. All right, so here are the curds now at about the halfway point. So again, you can see these curds they're big and they're strong and they're actually kind of wanting to mat together because they're just good, solid, healthy curds. And I really don't want them to mat together yet. We're in the stirring the curds, so they're releasing the whey. So I may be being a little more aggressive with this stir here than you might be given whatever your milk source is. So if your curds aren't looking quite this heavy duty, be a little gentler with them is the bottom line there. All right, and then here they are after about an hour of this gentle stirring. So you can see they've gotten quite a bit smaller, which they should, because the whole point of this stirring was to release whey from the curd. But they're certainly not fine little rice-sized curds, which we might be going for in, say, something like a Parmesan. And now we're going to just put that lid on and let the curds settle a bit. And the reason we're letting them settle, this could take 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes, is just so that this next step is a little bit easier, which is where we're going to remove the whey. We're just going to remove some of the whey until we get to where we can see the top of the curds. This is a method I do a lot, just with a ladle and a bowl and a skimmer to catch any curds I accidentally catch. If you have another method for removing whey from the curds, that's fine. The exact amount of whey you remove isn't that important in this particular make. We're mostly removing the whey at this point so that we can get the curds out of the pot easier. They're not going to sit in this whey for very long, so the lactic development that happens with curds sitting in whey isn't going to change significantly. Whereas some cheeses that you might be familiar with, say washed curd cheeses like Colby and Havarti and Gouda, the amount of whey you remove matters because you're going to replace it with water and the same amount to wash the curds, and more or less water to whey ratio will make a cheese milder or sharper. But in this particular case, I wouldn't get too worried about how much exact whey you remove. In fact, you could skip this altogether and just go straight to the colander if you wanted to. And so the next step is to take those finished curds and now let them drain in your cheesecloth lined colander. So this again was a gallon of goat milk. This was goat milk in the fall from a high butter fat breed, the Nubians. If your yield from a gallon of milk doesn't quite look like this, don't panic. It's not that you probably did anything wrong. You just might be using different milk. Maybe you have even more curds than I got, but I had a pretty good yield from this gallon of milk. Now we're going to tie those opposite corners of our cheesecloth together to form some type of a bag. I like to hang it in a big pot to drain overnight. So remember, this cheese is that cheese of two pastes, and these are going to be our older curds. And theoretically, this is about the point where the little shepherd boy got preoccupied by his love interest and should have kept going with making whatever cheese he was making, but he got distracted and left it overnight. We're going to do it on purpose. Now, do you have to drain them exactly like this? No, the idea is just to let them drain. So if you have another method, some people like to hang the bag on a sink faucet and have a bowl underneath to catch the whey so you don't get splashback from the dirty sink. Some people might hang it on their cabinet knob and have a bowl or a pot underneath. You could even leave this theoretically sitting in the colander, maybe closed up so that it's not getting dust and things on it. But the idea here is just to let them hang in some way overnight. All right. So that was make number one. Not too hard. Yes, that looks a lot like the makes of a lot of other cheeses, right? Because that's kind of how cheese making is. They all start out very similarly, and then it's what we do next that is what makes so many different cheeses out of these same basic raw ingredients. So on day two, sometime in the morning or perhaps early afternoon, you're going to go ahead with your second batch and repeat steps 1 through 9. Okay, I know I don't exactly have 9 slides here, but you got the idea. Repeat everything until you get to the point where your curds are now draining in the colander. And in the meantime, that other bag of curds has just been sitting overnight waiting for you to come back and remember it. Okay, so now you're going to come back and remember that bag of curds. And we're going to take it out of the bag and just break it into little 1 to 2 inch chunks. How you break these up isn't terribly important. You could cut them if you want to. I like to just break them apart with my hands because I feel like it gives the marbling pattern a little bit more of a natural look than having kind of square edges. So just breaking them apart. If you want bigger marbling pattern, break them into bigger chunks. If you want a tighter marbling pattern, make them into a little bit of smaller chunks. Because remember, these are our older curds. These are the ones that are going to be hidden in the center of our little form. And they're the ones that are going to really create that marbling pattern. So here I am just in quick motion, breaking up the rest of this little curd chunk. All right, so now you've got everything ready to put everything together. Here is my pot of older curds. Here are my 2 forms and my pot of newer curds. And so I'm going to start with one of these, and I'm going to make, like I said, 2 1-gallon batches because I have 2 gallons of curd. So I'm going to start with the newer curds, the fresher, more moist curds. And we're going to put them in our form, trying to cover the bottom and kind of come up the sides, sort of creating a well in the center. Because remember, that little shepherd boy that was not paying attention to his cheese making wanted to hide his mistake. So he figured he'd hide it. Now, this is just folklore. Who knows if that really happened? But he's hiding those curds that got neglected last night in the center of these newer curds, which perhaps he was making some other type of cheese that was a much softer, more moist cheese, right? So he's hiding them in there. Now, he probably also wasn't using blue mold powder. And so there were probably some other mistakes that happened during this make initially too. But that's basically how I do it, is I put a little bit of the moist curd on the bottom, kind of pile up a little on the sides, add a few of the older curds, and then come back and add a little bit more of the newer curds around the edges until you get to where your pot is about full, or your form is about full. And then you want to make sure the final curds are the fresher curds. Okay, and that's what's going to go on top. Part of that is because these fresher, wetter curds are going to knit together much easier than those harder, older curds. And so we want them on all the outer edges. But the whole point is we don't want those inner curds to knit together, because that's going to give these little pockets of air for the blue mold to form. I did find that at least one of the recipes I consulted actually did make this as a pressed cheese. And I opted not to try that, because my experience with these cheeses that we're trying to get that marbling effect on the inside, Stilton is another one that has that pattern, is that it really doesn't work very well if you press the cheese, because now you're pressing out all those little holes. Even with a lightweight, it can be easy to lose those little pockets of air. And then you're having to rely just on the piercing of the cheese to get your veins, and you won't get that marbling. So I opted to do no weight at all. And that's where having these fresh, moist curds surrounding those drier internal curds is so important. All right, so now I've got my 2 forms completely filled with both the old curds and the new curds, and I'm ready to let them sit in those forms. They're going to sit actually overnight, so it's going to sit for quite a while, but initially we're going to do some flipping. So we let it sit and start to settle for about just 15 minutes, and then you're going to flip them, and I'll just show you my technique. Again, many of you have different techniques for flipping cheeses, but I find these little small needlepoint mats very handy for flipping cheese that's in a bottomless form, right? I also used a basket. That's just a big basic basket from New England Cheesemaking Supply in place of needlepoint round, just to give you another option for how you could easily flip these. So you want to flip them after about 15 minutes. And then you're going to continue flipping them about once every 30 minutes for at least 2 hours. If you're around and you want to flip them longer, that's fine. It won't hurt anything to flip them more often. But I would do it at least for those first 2 hours. That's going to help you get adequate draining and forming of that form. After about 2 hours, things have cooled enough and dried enough that you're not going to get a whole lot more knitting together. So that's why it's really important to continue flipping this very regularly during those early hours. But at some point, you're going to stop flipping them because you're going to go to bed, and leave them in the forms to sit overnight. All right, and then in the morning, I am going to remove these from the forms. Now, that's the way I chose to do it, because when I took these out of the forms, they were lovely, they were holding together, everything looked great. Some of the recipes I consulted actually had you do the next step of salting and then put them back in the forms. So I would say it's going to depend a little bit on your cheese, even whether or not to apply weight. Obviously, I didn't apply any weight to these. They knit together quite well. They held their shape quite well. And so this worked for me. But in terms of just some troubleshooting, if your cheese isn't behaving quite this way, you know, if you have it to where at this point, after sitting all night, when you take it out of the form, it just crumbles apart and it doesn't hold as a wheel. I'm going to say first off that probably that means that you over stirred your curds. It's going to be a lot harder to get this to turn out as a gorgonzola. You may have to apply some weight to get those curds to knit together at this point. You may just end up with a different cheese. But the other thing that that could indicate is that your pH levels got too low, which means the acidity is too high. And that can happen sometimes if you're using raw milk, because as you know, raw milk is full of culture. And I tell you initially, well, cut back on your culture by at least half. But that's a guess, right? I don't know how much live culture is in your raw milk. And so oftentimes I see this over acidification happen with raw milk. I think I do give you a pH reading of where you should be at the end of that hanging and draining time. And so if you are using raw milk, you might want to run those pH times a little earlier in the process and continue on with the final steps sooner. But back to this particular make, I'm assuming pasteurized milk. I'm assuming pretty good quality milk. and that you're following kind of the times and temperatures I'm recommending. And hopefully you're going to get something that looks pretty similar to this. If you have something that's holding together, but it's so soft and it's so wet still, you may just leave the forms on for these next few days. You might not need any weight, but you might want to leave them in the form so that they can continue to get a little stronger and hold that shape as they dry. All right, I hope that's clear for everybody. If you're here with me in person and any of that, you need more clarification, please do message me in chat. But for those of you who are watching this, whether you're in person or watching live, you probably aren't going to know until you do it whether you have questions. All right, so now it's time to start salting these. And this is again where a little difference will happen between the dolce and the picante. And that is that the dolce is going to use less salt than the picante. All right, I do see a question here about how long should the second day curd hang. So the second day curd doesn't actually hang at all. So let's just go back so we can see the video. So we only went through steps 1 through 9. And if you look in your little handout, you'll see 9 takes you just to the scoop stage. So they haven't hung at all. They're still just freshly sitting in the colander, and you should go straight from that to putting them together. So they really won't be sitting long at all. I would have just finished my second make. I've put those curds into the colander so that they're draining slightly, and they're going to be really moist and still fairly warm. Okay, so no wait time on that second batch. Good question though, because I could see where you would get a little bit confused about that. Whoops. Okay, so we're back now to our salt amounts. So the total salt amount for if you are making the dolce is about 2 to 2.5 teaspoons per gallon. So measure that out in advance. You're going to, your first salt, you're just going to use about 1/4 of the salt. So just kind of estimate about 1/4. Cover the top of the wheel and sprinkle some on the sides, rub it in nicely. This is a dry salt, right? We're not brining this one. And a lot of times these cheeses that have lots of nooks and crannies that are very loosely pressed like this one use a dry salted method because the salt will soak in there quite nicely. All right, so that was our dolce, 1/4 of the salt. And then I just did a little quicker version of the picante because I'm doing the same thing, but I'm using more salt. Okay, so the picante version is going to use almost twice as much salt, 4 teaspoons per gallon. And that's going to have an effect on your final texture. If you remember, our dolce is much creamier, and so that lower salt helps us to not dry out the curd as much. And the picante is supposed to be a little drier. Also, the picante, we're going to really encourage that blue growth a little bit more and keep it from getting bitter, which sometimes can happen from blue molds. That little higher salt content will help. All right, so that was in the morning of the make on the second day, right? We had the first day make, we hung those curds, we let them, crumbled them up and just let them wait. And then we had our second day curds that we did fresh. And then that, that morning or that afternoon when we were putting them together, we did our first salting. And then this is still day 2 in the evening. We're doing another 1/4 of the salt, okay? So we're on day 2, but this is day 1 of the cheese being out of the form, if that makes sense, okay? All right, so just the top and the sides, and then we're gonna let those sit. Also, I'm gonna play that video one more time just to make sure we understood what I mean by top and side, because you have the top of the wheel, the bottom of the wheel, and the sides, but when you flip it, the top that was the top is now the bottom, and the thing that was the bottom is now the top. So I'm always talking about salting, whoops, let me go back to that, salting the top, but it's not always the same side, if that makes sense. So here was my top, I flip it, that bottom was the bottom, but now it's the top. Does that make sense? All right, so you're gonna salt that. And the reason we don't salt the whole thing is that when we turn it over like that, we're gonna lose some of that salt. And so this is gonna help you retain all that salt by just putting it on the top. With the sides, we know we're going to lose some of the salt, that it's going to fall off. And so we salt the sides every time, whereas we only salt the top and bottom once each flip. All right, so this was in the evening. And then we're going to do that quarter salting again on day 2 and day 3 of our makes. So let me make sure I'm making this make sense, which day is which. Day 1, we did a make, but we're not going to count that make. Day 1 in our lingo here was the day we put the wheel together, okay? So that would be day 1, the day we put the wheel together, and we did 2 saltings. Actually, I'm lying. Day 1 in this case would be the day that we start the salting, okay? So we're taking it out of the form, that's day 1. And so we're salting one side in the morning, we're salting the other side in the evening, and then we're going to leave it at room temperature, but I recommend you leave it in a container at room temperature. The first time through, some of the recipes I was following had you leave this out at room temperature, and I found that those wheels got just way too dry too quickly. And so I was a lot happier with doing it with them staying in a container while they're sitting at room temperature for 3 to 5 days. Okay, so on day 2, we're going to do this whole salting thing again, but just once this day. So about a 1/4 teaspoon on the top and sides, and then we'll wait to day 3 to do the final 1/4. So this video that I'm showing you is day 3. Okay, I didn't make you watch me salt it every single time. So this is the final day for the dolce. Because if you look in your recipe, you'll see that the dolce only sits at room temperature like this for 3 days. It is now ready to go in the container in the aging space. So your aging space, hopefully being some type of refrigerator that you can keep at about 50 to 55 degrees. Okay, whereas the picante, it's its final day of salt. Everybody gets all of its salt done in 3 days. But the picante is going to stay out at room temperature for another 2 days, okay, in its container, but out at room temperature. And again, that's because the picante, we want to develop a lot more of the mold and to be a much sharper, stronger flavor. And so these remaining 2 days at room temperature are going to lend themselves to that. So back to our dolce, and now we're going to finish out the dolce olme. Is at 3 days at room temperature, we put it into its aging space. We're going to flip it every few days while it's in that aging space, just to make sure that we're not getting it soggy. It's still a pretty moist cheese. If you have a lot of excess moisture on the lid of your container, you may want to wipe that off. And this is where I'm not going to talk a ton about humidity right now, but I will mention it more at the end. Whatever method you're using to retain humidity, just know this is a pretty high humidity cheese. Dolce probably a little higher than the picante, somewhere between 85 and 95%. So we don't want the cheese to have dripping water on it. That's going to create mildew, but we really want it to almost have dripping water on it. So that's where when you open your container, you can kind of modify it by what you're seeing in the container. And if it's too moist, just wipe off that excess humidity. Now we're going to pierce the dolce after about 7 to 10 days. You'll notice that this wheel is looking much more golden than my original wheels, and that's because I've now switched. This was a later make based on some things I learned the first time around for dolce, and this time around I did use cow milk. So this is this cheese at just a couple of weeks. I think it says 7 to 10 days. That may be about right. And you can see it's got quite a lot of nice mold development. It's pretty soft still, and we're piercing it here. Okay, so about 7 to 10 days. If you want more mold in your dolce, you could pierce it both at 7 and 10 days. If you want a little less mold, just pierce it once in there. All right, and as far as piercing, if you haven't made any blue cheeses yet, you know, typically I'm using a skewer, a stainless steel skewer that I've sterilized. Make sure you aren't using sanitizer like bleach, or if you do use a sanitizing solution on it, make sure you've rinsed it thoroughly, because in this particular, boiling it is your best bet, because in this case, we don't want to accidentally introduce something that's going to inhibit the growth of mold, right? Because we're opening up these holes to encourage the growth of that blue mold. So any residual bleach or even a sanitizer could inhibit your mold growth inside there. So just sanitize that skewer or your knitting needle or whatever you're using with boiling water if you can. All right, and then with the Dolce, you have some choices here. And again, I'll talk about some of these at the end. But I would say if you can continue flipping it for at least 2 or 3 more weeks to allow that mold growth to happen, and then wrap it in your foil and continue aging it for about 2 months, that's going to help you get maximum blue mold, but still maximum moisture retention. And if you haven't tried it yet, some of my pictures here, you'll see I'm using regular foil, but I really like this cheese foil wrap. I just didn't have any when I did some of my earlier videos. This is from New England Cheesemaking Supply. They're really big sheets, and so you may want to cut them down to fit whatever your size of wheel is. This was a 1-gallon wheel, and so I've cut this down a bit. But this wrap is much better than just using foil because it's a little bit more breathable than the foil wrap. And I feel like this is the optimal wrap to continue allowing your cheese to get enough air to let the blue really take on its character, but to also retain enough moisture that you don't just dry it out, especially for the Dolce, because that's the one you want it to stay really, really moist. And again, this is much how I wrap when I'm wrapping my bloomy rinds, just kind of pinwheel wrap it, take a little tape and tape that off. And then I'm going to let it continue aging in the wrap, because I found that the first time through I didn't do that. And while I got great flavor, the moisture was a little bit less than I would have liked. I wanted it to be creamier. So this time around, I'm going to let it age in the wrap. All right, so for the Dolce, we're going to let it age for about 2 months, and your texture is going to vary based on a number of things, right? Based on your milk source, based on how big you cut those curds, how much you stirred the curds, how they came together when you knit them, maybe even the percentage of older curds versus newer curds that you used, and then how your aging facility was set up, what your humidity level was. And you'll see that these are all pictures of professionally made Dolce versions of Gorgonzola, and their textures vary a lot. This one on the left is quite creamy. One in the middle, maybe somewhere in the middle there. And this one's a lot drier, yet this is a DOP Gorgonzola Dolce from Italy. So there is going to be some variability in how these turn out, and you may wish for something different depending on your preferences. And so at the end, I'm going to give you some tips for how to get what you're wanting based on some of the techniques that you use. All right, so that was our Dolce. Gotta find my little arrow here. And I did this one specifically for Rebecca, who's here on the call. This is a great version of a Vivaldi Dolce where they had that big wheel and they cut it on the horizontal. And then they put it in this beautiful wooden box and sell it just like that. So this top edge here is very creamy. That was the center of the cheese. It's very, very creamy. And then you can see the rind around the outer edge here. I just thought that was pretty cool. I would like to get some of those wooden boxes. All right, for the picante version now, we're going to do things a little differently. Remember that it's going to stay at room temperature for 5 days. And then we're going to place it in the container into the aging space. So that's one of the big differences between the Dolce and the picante, besides some of the others, which I will review at the end. 5 days at room temp, and then it goes into the aging fridge. All right, then we're going to pierce this a little bit later. We're going to let it go a little longer. Part of that so that it can dry out a little bit more so that those pierces stay a little bit better. Because as you know, a really creamy cheese, when we pierce it, some of that hole closes back in again and you won't get as much veining. So with the picante, we wait a little bit longer before we pierce it. And you don't have to do it exactly like this, but the recommendation from some of the recipes I saw was to do one piercing at about 2 weeks, day 15, and then pierce again at day 20. And you might just do the top one day and then do the other side one day. This is again where you can vary it based on your own desires, but also based on what you're seeing. If you see, like this wheel, a lot of good nooks and crannies, and you're feeling like that blue mold, I can already see it, is really taking hold, and it's going to be just marbling really nicely in there, might not feel like I need to do as many pierces. But if I'm looking at it, I'm at day 20 and I don't see a lot of mold, or if my curds knit together to the point where maybe the rind closed a little bit more than this did, maybe I even had to use weight and I still want it to be a blue cheese, but it isn't quite going to have this pattern, then I might pierce a lot more, right? Because the whole idea of the piercing is to get that oxygen into the wheel so that it can form the blue veins. So how much you need to pierce is not only a function of what you want at the end, but also what you've got at this stage. All right, and then for the picante, we're going to, and I will confess, this is an older version. It's older than 2 to 3 weeks that I'm showing you in this video, but I just wanted, this was a good example of that excess moisture on the lid that you might want to wipe off. This was at about 5 weeks. And you can see that it's gotten a lot drier on the outer edge. A few little reddish marks there, which may be the beginnings of some Brevibacterium linens. This one, I ended up, it was a really good cheese. Probably got a little drier than is ideal for this cheese. So I'll kind of talk about that toward the end. All right, and then with our picante, we're going to let it age for 3 to 6 months, and we're going to flip it at least once a month, if not more often. And when you choose to put the foil on is a little bit up to you and what you're seeing. In that particular cheese that I had, I think I would have, when I do it over again, let it retain a little bit more moisture at the beginning, which is why now I'm leaving the container lid on, so that I could get a little bit more of this bee linen rind to show up. But I wanted to show you these pictures. These are all commercial Gorgonzola picantes, and they're quite different from each other, both in terms of the amount of marbling, even a little bit the color of the marbling, and the rind development. And yet they all are meeting the standards for a DOP Gorgonzola. So I want you to feel okay if your cheese is, you know, more orange with bee linen development or less orange, maybe a little bit more of the white or blue molds. Also, you'll notice quite a few of these, there is no rind cut on the top because they've cut that off altogether, right? So that you're just seeing the marbling pattern. And then this one on top here has a very light rind, not very much at all. So these can vary quite a bit, and I'll talk a little bit in my final slide about how you can get yours to be more to your liking or control things that are happening that you don't want there. But these were some of my initial makes. I believe I did 4 different makes that all were at the exact same time. So this is at about 3 months, and the 2 on the left were different versions of the picante recipe, and the ones on the right were different versions of the dolce recipe. So you can see this one on the bottom probably looks the most like the dolces in some of those pictures, but I got to tell you, it was so bland and flavorless that I ditched that version of the recipe. It looked right. It did not taste right at all. Whereas the one up above here, it's not quite as moist as I would have liked, and maybe a little bit more marbling than is typical of a dolce, but the overall flavor was really good. And so I basically used this methodology and changed a few things in your recipe. But you can see that there's quite a bit of bee linen development starting on this because of the higher moisture. Whereas this one was a picante, more salt and more dryness and a more crusty rind. This one might have been able to stand to have a little more moist rind, but of all of them, this one actually, I thought, had the very best flavor. And so that says something about rind development, how you want to treat your rind as it's aging. And I'm going to talk about that in just a moment. This lower one here, you can see just didn't get a very good marbling pattern. And I don't even remember exactly which of my recipes this was, but I can tell by looking at it that it would have needed a lot more piercing to get blue in there. So the marbling pattern of these top two really was superior, and it's really what this recipe is based on, how I showed you to put your wheels together. All right. So this is that revised dolce that I'm working on right now. It's aging as we speak, and it just isn't quite ready, but this was just before I left. It was looking really good. It felt like the right texture, and this is the one I based my dolce recipe on. So also, this came up in one of our cheese chats the other day, just about the rind and, you know, all that rind that's on the outer edge of a blue cheese can be a little alarming, right? We aren't used to seeing that. And that's because most of the time when those cheeses are sold to you, a good bit of that rind has been cut off. So yes, we lose some of the cheese when we do it this way, but and so this I just thought I would show you, where I'm cutting, you know, a good bit of that rind off the top and bottom. I'll leave it on the sides because I don't mind that so much on a cheese plate, because a lot of people just won't eat the rind. But now that looks a little bit more like a cheese you might be expecting when you go to buy it. All right, and this was where I wrapped it with plain foil because I didn't have any of that fancy foil at the time. All right, so let's do some final summaries here. And this is where folks that are here in person, feel free to ask questions as I go through these. If you're doing this at home and you have some questions for me, you can email me. But a little final review of some of the differences between making this recipe in the dolce form versus the picante form. And I mentioned all of these throughout the video, but here's a review. First of all, you could use the PS, Penicillium roqueforti, for the dolce, and the PV for the picante. Not essential, but you could do that if you wanted them to be more different. Also stirring the dolce a little bit less and maybe cutting the curds a little bit bigger. Also, this is a difference in the recipe. We used less salt for the dolce than for the picante. We also had that shorter room temperature aging time for the dolce, 3 days versus 5 days for our picante. We also pierced the dolce a little sooner and maybe a little less amount of piercing than the picante, which we waited a little longer to pierce and perhaps gave it more piercings if desired. And then of course, the dolce has a shorter aging time. Now, in terms of affinage tips and troubleshooting, couple things. Some of these things could apply to many cheeses, not just to Gorgonzola. But if you do want more blue veins, obviously pierce it more often and with more holes. And sometimes you just won't know if you want more until the next time around, right? So a lot of times with these types of cheeses that are a little more complex, you may need to make this several times with your milk and your conditions to know which of these things you would change. If you want a slightly drier, crumblier texture, you're going to be going for a little lower relative humidity. Typically, you're going to be shooting for about 85%. Now, how you're managing humidity is going to vary a lot depending who you are. You saw that I primarily am managing humidity by the use of a container. Some of you are actually using a humidifier in your aging space. Some of you might be using wooden boards or humidity bricks. There's all kinds of ways. But know that a drier, crumblier texture would require a little lower humidity. And if you want a more moist, creamier texture, perhaps a higher humidity. Also, your aging time is going to really affect that final texture. So most of the time it's going to get a little drier as it ages, so a longer aging period, and it'll be creamier in that shorter time frame, so more in that 2-month time frame. Now, whether or not to keep your rind clean as it's aging or letting it go wild. Any of you who have known me for a while and take my classes know that I am a big proponent of letting rinds go wild. And part of that is just, I find it a little easier. I just let them do their thing and then I tend to them later and deal with it. You can go too far with that methodology. When you let a rind go wild, sometimes it takes over your cheese. So it isn't that you can completely ignore it and not pay any attention. You may want to monitor it and decide how wild you want to let it go. There's another school of thought, especially with blue cheeses, because a lot of people are really intimidated by how much stuff grows on the outer rind of a blue cheese, because we've just put a whole bunch of blue mold into the milk. So we're going to expect a lot of blue mold wherever there's air, and the rind has got a lot of air, right? So sometimes people are intimidated by the amount of growth they're seeing on the outer edge, and they prefer to keep it a little cleaner. And you can do that by, using a little brine solution or a little brush or what have you. There are pros and cons to that. I would say on the pro side, you may, in doing that method, using some brine to continue to maybe clean up your rind as you go, you're probably going to keep a bit more moisture on the surface of your rind, and that's going to promote Brevibacterium linens. If you're not familiar with that term, we didn't add bee linens to this recipe. Bee linens are very much associated with washed rind cheeses. So bee linens are a red mold powder essentially, and we often add them to washed rind cheeses. But they are naturally occurring, and they will show up in all kinds of cheeses because they love a very moist environment. And so if you're cleaning your rind as you go, you may find that you get a lot more bee linens than you want, or you might just find that you get the amount of bee linens that you want versus letting it go wild like I did. I got much more of the blue and grays and blacks taking over and much less of that bee linen look. So there's pros and cons. The other thing I would say, and I'll just go back real quick, and I do see your question there, Ripley, and I'll come back to it. But just to go back to this slide, where you saw this much more drier, crumblier rind versus the more moist bee linen rind, this one looks really beautiful. This one had more flavor. And I have now this one was a very close second, but I will just say that I have found letting your rind grow wild, especially in the blue cheese, tends to promote a stronger blue flavor. And so I tend to like to do that, but I would say that mine probably doesn't have the amount of bee linen look that a lot of those well-aged DOP cheeses have. So that's just going to be something up to you to experiment a little with. But when you do get bee linens starting to form, any of you who have struggled with bee linens in your cheese caves know they can really run away with things. And what I mean by that is that bee linen can create a very slimy, gritty rind. And once it takes hold, it's hard to get it to back off. So some tips if you get a little more bee linen development than you want in this cheese or that you're comfortable with, you can scrape off some of that. And I hate to use the word slime, but that's basically what it becomes when it's a runaway case of bee linens. Scrape it off with a knife and then wipe it with a dry cloth, and then crack or remove the lid of your container or in some way reduce the humidity. Because if you just try to wipe off bee linens with brine, you're just going to encourage them because they love that moist environment. So getting rid of them by scraping them off with a knife and then patting it dry with a dry cloth and then reducing the humidity is the best way to try to get some control back if your bee linens kind of start taking over your cheese. Now, in terms of when to wrap your cheese, again, for the biggest flavor and the most blue development, you'll wrap a little bit later. I didn't wrap until about 3 months with that Gorgonzola because I let my rind get pretty dry and crusty so that I would really maximize the flavor. And then to let it continue to age, I went ahead and wrapped it at that point so that I wouldn't get any more moisture loss, but I could get more flavor. If you want to have a little more control over your rind development, you may want to wrap it sooner. Or in the case of a dolce, you're really wanting to retain as much of that moisture as you can, you may want to wrap it sooner. So again, is there an absolute time of when you should wrap or not wrap? Not really. I think some of it's just going to depend on what's happening with your wheel and what you want with your wheel. Okay, now let me look at a couple questions for the folks that are here in real time. The penicillium roqueforti PA and PJ on cheesemaking.com are two other varieties, but the two that I'm recommending are the PV and the PS. I have to be honest, I have not worked with every variety of penicillium roqueforti. So I'm basing some of this on reading, and most of the time I'm hearing PV and PS being the ones recommended. I believe it's the PV that is specifically recommended for Gorgonzola. So what is going to be the difference? The difference is mildness, quickness of development, and even color of molds. Some blue molds are more on the green side of blue, and some are more on the darker blue side. So again, I think if you have, in the case of somebody here, Joan has said has PA for the Danish blue, and it's supposed to be for a more mild variety. Yeah, so PA might be just fine for Dolce, or PA might be just fine for your picante, and it's just not going to be as picante, right? Or as blue. Maybe to make up for the fact that it's a milder variety, maybe you're going to pierce it more often and let it age a little bit longer. Maybe you're even going to try to scrape some of that Gorgonzola mold off of a really good Gorgonzola you buy and add it. Because like I said, these penicillium roqueforti mold spores are not inexpensive. And so I often say, just work with what you've got, because, unless you want to drop a whole bunch more money for a specialty mold. But so those are some ways you could kind of manipulate what you've got to work a little bit more like what you want. All right. So that is the conclusion of this class. Feel free, for those of you who are still here with me, to ask any more questions that you would like. I think what I'm going to do here in just a moment is go ahead and end the recording, and then I'll stick around and see if you all have more questions. So if you do have questions and you're watching this as a recording, please do email us at info@theartofcheese.com. And we'll say a quick goodbye to the goats, because we always start and end with the goats in my classes. So here they are coming in for a little treat. You can see they're very bossy and pushy. And we'll say goodbye to them. I do see one comment in here about smaller quantities of some of the penicillium roquefortis at Cheesemaker. Yes, thank you for mentioning that, because I did mean to mention that. Cheesemaker.com is another source for cheesemaking supply, and some of those specialty cultures that come only in big packs at New England Cheesemaking Supply, you may find in smaller quantities there. So New England Cheesemaking is cheesemaking.com, and I believe the Cheesemaker might be cheesemaker.com. At any rate, if you look it up, it's the Cheesemaker. All right, so final little goodbye slide. And I thank you all so much for attending. I'm going to end the recording here, and I'll stick around for those of you who are at the live class. Hope to see you all again soon.